bills in front of us today. We have House Bill 59, House Bill 60, and House Bill 35. At any time, any of you who wish to comment on any of these bills, if y'all would sign in, or either you'll have an opportunity to be recognized when we start discussion. First off, House Bill 59. Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring to you House Bill 59, which in essence is the exact same text as House Bill 687 from last session, which made it out of the House with 132 votes with basically very little opposition. What this does is requires alarm companies to place a second call in the event of alarm prior to dispatching services. As you know, 90+% of all residential alarms are false statewide. What the effect of this bill is it conserves police resources, saves money, keeps officers on their primary tasks rather than running to the end of the county. Particularly in your rural areas, you might have an officer for dispatch for a long portion of a shift answering a false alarm. What this does not do in the event of a duress, fire, medical emergency, or if you have an audio or visual signal like you see on TV, intruder, you're in the house, we see you, this would not require a second call in that aspect. The end effect of this is just requiring the alarm companies to have a second call if, say, Mr. Cook was a primary on his house. If they got an alarm, they'd call him. What you would have is a secondary number to call prior to the dispatching service, just to make sure it's like, oh, we didn't let the dog out or things like that. Again, relatively simple bill. It passed overwhelmingly in the House last year, had very few questions in committee or anything, ended up getting in front of Senate rules 8 times with this at the end of the session and ran out the clock. I have 2 subject matter experts here to answer any questions on this, and I will be glad to answer questions as well, sir.
Any members that wish to have any questions this time?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Taylor, is this the same bill that we passed last year but just didn't make it to the floor of the House?
Correct. The House had voted it out 132 yay, 9 nay, 33 not voting, and 6 excused. So it overwhelmingly went out. Literally just got caught up in the clock at the end of the session. Came out of Senate committee without almost a single question. It just, one of those Senate rules things at the end of the session, ran out the clock on it. It's exactly the same language.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Frazier.
Yes, Representative Taylor. The initial first alarm system goes off, and I know that is a lot of false alarms because mine go off like that too. But what is the time frame within that second, in case there is something going on?
The time frame to dispatch that, and I may call my subject matter experts up here to do that, is in my recollection from last year, less than a minute. Again, okay. You're dispatching services very quickly. If you hit a panic alarm or right. a medical alarm or a fire alarm, something like that, there is no delay whatsoever. They're going on the first indication. Or if they can see somebody visually or audibly hear somebody there, they're going on the first indication. What the effect of this bill does is a lot of these false alarms end up tying up 1 or 2 officers in an urban area or a suburban area like I live in for 15, 20, 30 minutes, where they're not doing their primary jobs. If you're a county police force, that could be a half hour, that could be an hour that you have somebody out of service.
Yeah, I'm fine, Representative. I supported it last year.
Thank you.
Questions? Did the chair understand you have some experts who want to testify?
If we have further questions, sir. Otherwise, I know you've got some other bills before the committee. If you've got further questions, I can bring those folks up there sitting in the room here.
Come on up. We've got a little time because we're waiting on some members to get here from appropriations.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. My name is Billy Grogan. I'm the Chief of Police with the Dunwoody Police Department, and I certainly support this bill. As Representative Taylor said, this is a problem for law enforcement not only in Georgia but across the United States. Over 90% of alarms are false, and there's a couple things that happen because of this. A lot of officers get complacent in their response to false alarms, so they're used to it. Oh, that's the alarm that always goes off, and they kind of drop their guard. And there's been several instances across the country where officers have been injured because they surprised a burglar, and they didn't realize it because they'd kind of dropped their guard. And the second that's been mentioned is the use of resources, both time and money, gas, wear and tear on vehicles, to get back and forth to the alarm calls. A lot of jurisdictions are passing a false alarm ordinance, but that's kind of a political hot potato in a lot of jurisdictions to do that. And so the majority of cities, counties in the state of Georgia will not ever be able to pass an alarm ordinance. And what this bill does is provides the two-call enhanced call verification, so that they call me if my alarm goes off. If I don't answer the phone because I'm busy, they'll call my wife if she's listed. And, chances of getting one of us is pretty good. I know, for instance, my mother-in-law lives in the basement with us, and sometimes she has a tendency to set the alarm off. And so one of us usually knows if it's her. So that'll help reduce the number of false alarms without just by passing this ordinance and the alarm companies complying with it. By probably 15 to 25%, and in the other states that it's been enacted, they've had similar reductions. I'd be happy to answer any questions about it.
Darlene?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is good. I understand the need for it. Is there a penalty? What happens if repeatedly a particular vendor does not? I have alarms at home. I have it at my office, so I'm very familiar with it. And we do get false alarms. So what's going to happen if this vendor does not call?
I'm not sure if there's a penalty built into that particular bill. I know a lot of the local ordinances, there is penalties built in for not doing that. I'm not sure about this bill.
Okay, I didn't see one in here, but I know we've had some discussion of local legislation, and there was a penalty if there was not. I don't see one here. What happens if somebody's
again?
The
Language of the bill reads "shall." There's no specific penalty in, and I think that was a more of a difficult process. A lot of the alarm companies do this voluntarily now. This bill is backed by the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police and most of the alarm companies. The issue comes up, and as Chief Grogan said, you get the local ordinances that on a county or a city basis that'll try to impose some sort of fines, and there was just really not any level of consensus on the state. The ordinance reads "shall," and the legislation reads "shall." So under state law, that shall comply, but there is no financial penalty now.
Okay, that was the concern. Is it going to be the responsibility of the alarm company, the property owner? Where does this go to?
No, we recently passed an ordinance in Dunwoody, and part of the process is when an alarm company calls the 911 center, the 911 center asks for the permit number, since we have a permit, or they will, and they also ask for the two numbers they called, and so they ask them to provide those numbers. So I guess different jurisdictions could do it different ways as far as asking for those numbers and requiring them to provide that number based on the state law.
Okay, we're just not requiring it in this piece of legislation. Thank you very much.
Chief, if I might ask, what if it's say a single individual, there's only one member in the family? What happens if there's not a second number?
Well, if they don't have anybody in their family, they could certainly, a neighbor, coworker, just anybody. But if they don't have anybody to provide a second number, obviously that they won't be able to provide that number.
All right.
Again, Mr. Chairman, it says it shall make a reasonable attempt is the language in the bill to collect a second number. If there are certain circumstances where somebody does not have a second number, I've got 3 cell phone numbers myself, but it says reasonable attempt, and I think the point of reasonable is if somebody can't provide a second number, they just can't do it.
All right. Thank you, Chief. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Chief Heaton from Fayetteville. We recently, within the last 6 months, enacted an ordinance, a false alarm ordinance. I support the current bill. In answer to the question the representative had about the double call, that's done within 30 seconds in our city. I mean, you make the first phone call, you don't get a response within 30 seconds. You're making the second phone call, and so therefore you don't have folks waiting long periods of time to get a response if they really need one. And I think the dynamic is that the officer's already dispatched, so they're already en route while they're trying to get that second call verification. If they're discontinued along the way, then that would not count as a false alarm. In support of this, I think one of the things we didn't talk about is the safety of the officers and the public. When somebody has an alarm go off, our officers are responding either quickly or they're actually running with lights and siren. And I think that with false alarms, and in our city, it was 80% of our alarm calls were false alarms. In addition to the resources that are tied up in our city, I had folks that were placing themselves in danger and the public in danger responding to these alarms. And I can tell you in the 6 months that we've had the ordinance in place and that we've been enforcing it, the double call verification is the most important component of that ordinance, and that's what's in the current bill. The fines that we levy on folks really aren't the motivating factor for reducing the alarms. It's the double call verification that seems to be the most successful. So I think that the bill, as it's written, is requiring us statewide to do that, makes it uniform for those cities that don't have ordinances, for them to have at least a double call verification or an enhanced verification.
Any questions for the chief? Thank you, Chief.
Mm-hmm.
In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any more questions, but I ask for your favorable consideration and ask for a due pass, sir.
Very good. Chair will entertain a motion at this time. We have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a second. Now, do we have any questions or any comments from the public? Any discussion of the committee? If not, all in favor? As opposed? My ayes have it. It's on the way. All right, we have House Bill 60. Representative Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I guess we all know the risks of calling a bill simple. HB 60 arises out of a constituent call. I've got a gentleman back home who's a retired juvenile court judge, and it was his understanding that all juvenile court judges received carry privileges once they retired. But when he went in to see about signing up for himself, it turned out that because he retired under ACCG's retirement plan, he was excluded. And the current wording of the statute says under state retirement, and that's where the interpretation came from. I've touched base with ACCG, and apparently since the late 90s, everyone has been involved in the plan with the state under state retirement. But prior to that time, ACCG was providing some of those plans. Some of the bigger counties provided some of those plans. We've taken a look at the numbers, and while there's no real hard and fast figure, the guess is you're talking a maximum of 100 folks around the state who would be impacted by this one way or another. Now, again, like I said, at the risk of calling a bill simple, and this one apparently is not, I've had a discussion with counsel, and she has raised the question of whether this language as we have it in front of us would necessarily be effective in doing what I'm trying to do. And so there's a question of, is there another way to word this? And I guess some other considerations as well. And frankly, as I've said, my interest here is simply to try to solve this problem for my constituent. If the committee agrees it's a problem worth solving, I am more than happy to pursue it at your discretion of how. And if I may, I'd like to ask counsel to expand upon the questions that have been raised.
All right. Questions from the committee? Representative, we're going to give you a copy of a substitute. If you
Sorry?
haven't already seen, we've got a substitute.
She has a substitute that she's worked on. Yes, sir.
We'll give you just a second to look over that.
Again, please, I have to have.
We'll give you just a second to look over the substitute.
Yeah, let me double check. And yeah, it's what she discussed with me
Okay.
earlier.
Representative Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The substitute may have taken care of what my questions were, which to include the magistrate and probate and juvenile courts. Would those judges, they weren't named specifically, but this substitute looks like local judges would include them? Probate and magistrate, juvenile? I'm just
And again,
verifying
that's
it. Thank
part of
you.
the question, does this expand the
Okay.
purview of the bill? And again, I'm willing to go with the committee's discretion on this.
Clarifies the issues presented. I apologize, it's a very crude handout. It was done very quickly. Current law is marked in green. These are the folks, the judges, the types of judges that can carry anywhere without a permit. You see federal court judges, state court judges, and city court judges, local magistrates, although they may believe to be covered by current law, they actually are not. Then in the middle you see retired judges. Of that group, the current law only permits state retired judges. What the original bill does is in red, it adds those state judges that are also under the county retirement system, and the state judges are listed at the bottom. What the substitute would do would be bring in everybody, not only what's in the red, but also what you see in the white. And I think that may clarify it better than trying to explain in any other way.
Very good. Thank you, Terry. Darlene? Ms. Taylor, any other questions? I'm done. All right. Number 29. Representative Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that kind of cleared my question up, but I had a question about the bill. If they're retired, can they just not get a license to carry a gun?
Well, I should imagine they can, but I guess there was a policy decision at some point in the past to automatically extend this privilege, at least in some cases, and here we have some inconsistency.
Okay.
Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Terry, can you clear this up for me? When you said that they can carry guns anywhere, does that mean everywhere?
Yes, if you look at Title 1611-130, there's an extensive laundry list of the types of people who are not required to get a permit, and it not only excludes them from the permit requirement, it also excludes them from what I call the locality restrictions. Mm-hmm. That is, they could carry in a public place. And there's a laundry list of people, attorney generals, solicitors, prosecutors, I don't know if you want me to name them all. There's exactly 16 constables, probation officers, pardon and parole board employees.
And when you say everywhere, you mean they can carry them in churches now, on the airplane?
Yes, ma'am.
Everywhere is everywhere.
Yes, it's everywhere. Yes.
So with this bill, these judges they want to be able to do what the rest of them are doing.
And currently, what you see in green can already do that.
Right.
What you see in green can already do that. It's just the wording of the current law is probably had unintended consequences to exclude this subset of judges.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. Number 18. Representative
At the
Dawson.
proper time, I was just going to make a motion on those questions that the council explained. I understand, so at the
All
proper
right, if
time.
you'll give us just a second, we've got a couple more questions. Representative Atwood.
Just a couple, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir. Just one question. I support your bill, but I'm a little concerned about one point of clarification. And I'm sure it would be very, very small, but a retired judge who may, for whatever reason, be later declared to be mentally incompetent, a judge mentally incompetent, or convicted of a felony. Do we have a provision in the later part of the code that deals with that? Because I haven't reviewed the whole code on this.
Representative Atwood.
I agree. That's a valid question.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, yes, the current law requires that the person be eligible under both federal and state requirements. So they could not have committed a felony or be mentally incompetent or any of the typical restrictions that we see of someone who's permitted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, do we have any other questions? Do we have anyone in the audience that wishes to address this issue? Yes, sir. You would come up and identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Monroe from GeorgiaCarry.org. I've discussed this with Representative Holt a little bit, and I find myself in a rather unusual position of not really supporting a bill that ostensibly expands the right to carry firearms, and that is because Georgia Carry doesn't support the notion of having people be exempt from the laws based on their current or former jobs. We're generally not in favor of having this system whereby some people, by virtue of their current job or their former job, are permitted to carry firearms, where the general population of people that have licenses and have undergone background checks for the express purpose of being able to carry a firearm are not able to carry them. So we don't support adding people to this list on 1611-130 based on what their occupation is or used to be. I don't have any further comment on it. Like I said, I've discussed it with Representative Holt, but I would be happy to answer any questions the panel might have.
Do we have any questions of the gentleman? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do we have anyone else that wishes to comment? All right, if not, Representative Talton.
At this time, I would like to make a motion to pass House Bill 60
as a committee as a committee substitute. All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a second. Do we have any other discussion? Any other questions? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. You're on the way.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, yes. House Bill 35.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I want to start off by saying that this is not a firearms bill. This is a school safety bill. I've tried to make that quite clear throughout the process. My intent is that we find a way, or in a better way, to secure our schools. My grandchildren during Christmas was asked to make a list of what they wanted. And you can imagine from 14-year-old down to 14 months old, we had a varied list of things that they wanted. There was some very expensive. We could not do it. But we tried to find some things that they would be pleased with and was best suited for them. And we tried to make their Christmas a better Christmas. I thought about it as we get older, we have wish lists too, and it changes a little bit. We're not asking for toys and bicycles and some other things. Ours has become a little more serious. In the last few days, I have gone through some of the wish lists that I, as a person now 65 years old, have wanted. And if I had a wish list, and if you will indulge me, I just jot some of these down. I wish that there was no longer any home invasions where people were injured or killed. I wish there was no more hijackings where people were injured or killed. I wish that there was no shootings at malls and places of business and places of worships and many others. I wish that there was no more rape and murder. I wished our schools were free of fear of violence. I wished every school system in Georgia had a sufficient funding budget to hire a resource officer for each school. I wished that House Bill 35 was not necessary, but it is. And I'm here today to share with you some things, convictions, and some things that that's in this bill that I think that are important. With budget constraints that we have in our school systems, it's almost impossible for them to come up with the additional money that would hire or would maybe even contract with a security company to come in and provide the much needed resources for securing a school as we feel like that they need. Because of that, we came up with an alternative, and this is the alternative. And if you follow along with me in the bill itself, it is not complicated. It's very much to the point. One of the things that I found that might be interesting is that there are those within the school system that are concerned about the security of their schools. In some cases, how porous and how available some entrances are into their school. And of course, most of all is not having that resource person available. And so this is just to deal with that option of whether or not we have a security person in those schools. If you look at the bill itself, it talks about that a school board, and all the school boards in the state of Georgia may designate one or more administrators at each school in the school system to possess and carry a firearm within the school safety zones. The important part of this bill is that it carries the may, not shall. This is an option that would not require any school system in the state of Georgia to actually follow through on this. This only gives the option for them to consider this as an alternative. And because administrators normally are not in a classroom, they would not be exposed to children on a full day basis other than when they would be met in a hallway or in the cafeteria. So the administrators were the ones that felt like that would be the most appropriate to work this security through, and therefore the school board, being the agency or being the group that would make the determination of those school administrators, would make the choice of what administrator, either one or more, in each of the schools so that they might carry a firearm. The other concern was, after dealing with the situation of realizing that in many of our schools we do not have sufficient coverage as far as resource officers or maybe law enforcement from our local jurisdictions, such as our sheriff's department or our police departments. And we did not want to have the situation of people as administrators or individuals as administrators even chosen to be that resource person in the school, not completely prepared to encounter the necessary things that they would have to do in case of an emergency. And because of this, we looked at this and we developed that they have to go through a process. And this is the process. First of all, every resource person or every administrator that is chosen by the school board at their willingness to serve would have to, first of all, obtain a weapons carrying license permit according to code. That's the first thing that they have to do. Secondly, they would have to successfully complete the basic training course of peace officers. And there's one change that I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman, is that it says administered by the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. They do not do the training. So the administrative part there needs to be approved by the Georgia Peace Officer Standard and Training Council, or a training course developed specifically for school administrators designed under this same code. Not only would they be trained as a peace officer and going through the same training as does a peace officer, but also they would have to, and in the next portion of that, they would have to be qualified and would qualify with their firearm in continual training twice a year. I was talking with some that's in our training facility, Tim Bearden, and he made a suggestion, and I think it's a good suggestion, that instead of it being an annual training, that it would be twice a year, as does many law enforcement officers do. So that would be the only other change to this piece of legislation. Instead of it being annually qualifying with each of the firearms or he or she intends to possess, but it would be semi-annually that they would have to do this continual training. The last portion of this is, of course, the only financial responsibilities would be passed on to the local school boards. And the school boards would be responsible for paying for all of the training and any other compensation that they might see fit for this person to receive, because they take on the extra responsibilities of being a resource person, a safety resource person in a school. That would be much like someone that's in the school system and they also coach. They get additional compensation for that. But that would be left up to the school board. This is totally and completely in the hands of the school system itself. First of all, it's whether or not they participate at all. They do not have to. Secondly, if they do, then they make their choice. They make, through recommendations or other process, who this administrator will be in each school. Thirdly, they will have to go through all of the training necessary to qualify them. Fourth, they will have to continue their training working with the local law enforcement agents. And then, lastly, even in this continuing education, continuing training, that would be the responsibility of the local school system. It's not really a hard and difficult piece of legislation, but it's one that in some cases will be the only option some school systems will have. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop there, and I'll be willing to answer any questions that the committee might have. And I do not have anyone that I have asked to come to speak to this bill, but there may be others.
Thank you, Representative Battles. To the committee, I think that if you could, if you have questions of the author of the bill, let's ask them, and then I'm sure there's some other folks who wish to testify, and then we'll give Representative Battles or Chairman Battles a chance to answer other questions. All right, number 26. Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to my colleague who I have the utmost respect for. And I am an advocate for the Second Amendment. I would say that up front, but I do have some concerns. Number one, you mentioned basic training, similar to basic training. Military, we went through basic training too, but it took years to become proficient with weaponry. Law enforcement, the same thing. It takes years of experience to become proficient. And an administrator or a teacher moonlighting as a law enforcement officer is not my idea of keeping students safe. It has to be a situation where it becomes second nature to them in regards to their weaponry. And even with school boards having local control, you're still asking non-law enforcement personnel to make decisions about law enforcement. And so I have some concern with that. But my question, my concern, these are my concerns. So could you kind of speak to those concerns for me?
I could speak in this way, is that if an individual desired to be in law enforcement, one of the things that they would have to do is go through that mandate training. That is the first and the most important. And of course, they would go to the academy, and they would go through that particular training, which I believe in the full training is about 11 weeks. That's the basic training. I understand the basic training for the military and the other ongoing. I'm glad that police officers are not having to do that. We'd never get them on the street. But they are, in fact, trained with simulators, with everything that would be available to any police or any person that was desiring to be a police officer. One of the things that is kind of subliminal here, and I've talked with school systems and with law enforcement, and that is that as they do throughout the year, is they have simulations of school invasions, and that this resource officer would be working with the local law enforcement agencies to be a part of that exercise. So number one, they're identified who they are. Number two is what their place and what their responsibilities are. And so there is this ongoing training. No, they're not in the day-to-day out there for 8 to 10 hours a day and serving in the law enforcement field. But they do have training. They will have ongoing training, but they would not have to the extent that you had just spoke about.
Thank you. 28.
Thank you, Mr.
Frazier.
Chairman. Representative Bell, can you answer this question for me as it relates to school boards authorizing their school system to have their administrators carry arms? Suppose that administrator does not believe in the Second Amendment and they don't carry arms and they don't believe in firearms. What is the safety factor in them not being able to refuse that and not being dismissed from their jobs?
There would be no restriction to that. Again, that has come up about clarification of that, but the intent of this was not to force any administrator into that into a security officer position, and would not be subject to losing their job if they fail to do this. And if I could just one other point to this is, in talking with some of the administrators and going back to the question that was asked just a few minutes ago, there's a number of our administrators in our own community that are in the National Guard and have been deployed a number of times. And these individuals are well qualified because they've been out there on the front. Now, that might not be the case in every school system, but there are those who, at least to the extent that they've had ongoing training, that is worked. But to your question, the intent of this bill is not to put anyone in jeopardy of losing their job. Was not to be implied in any way, and I would be opposed to that.
Mr. Chairman, I have a further question.
Right ahead.
Well, with the makeup of some of our school boards, if the language is not in there and it's not Pacific, it could happen.
I do agree with you, and I would certainly ask that if there was some language that you would like to add to this bill that would cover that, I would certainly entertain it and be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions.
Certainly.
Does this have any effect on private or parochial schools at all?
No, it does not.
Okay, I didn't see where it addressed them at all.
No.
A couple other issues that kind of jumped out at me. When they name the administrator or the person, is this going to be done in a public meeting, or will this be a personnel issue that can be done in private?
Personnel matters are not for the public.
Okay, that's one of the things I wanted to make sure.
That is a board policy.
Okay. And when we talked about the officers or these folks that are going to be protecting the students, and we talked about them going through the weapons carrying, being trained, do we have anything in here that talks about a physical exam where they can run and do things healthy? I can see where a lot of retired police officers, this would be great. I just want to make sure it's somebody that's physically able to do the job, and I don't see where that's really addressed.
This again will be addressed when we come to the actual training itself. This will have to come through that council.
Okay.
And there will be, because of the seriousness of this, and because this is legislatively asked for, we're going to have to follow the guidelines of the Georgia Peace Officer Standard Training.
Okay. I have one further question, and just because of my little insurance is jumping out.
I understand.
Have we addressed the liability for coverage and making sure that, you know, the school is capable of insuring? I mean, is this person going to have workers' compensation? What about liability, that the any unforeseen things that happen? How will that be covered under the regular programs that the school has?
That is not something that I've tried to even cover.
Okay.
This has been asked for by a number of school boards and superintendents, and the liability issue will certainly have to be addressed.
At the school level?
At the school level,
okay.
That's right. Speaking to that is that some schools, and I'll go back to my county, Bartow County School, have a few resource officers, and they are under the coverage of liability. If that can be expanded, that will be something that will have to be dealt with by the local school boards, and the school boards are not going to take on additional liability without that coverage.
Thank you. I do feel like we need some protection in our schools, so I am very much in favor of seeing that the students are protected and using what resources that we can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Battles, thank you. I appreciate your intent, and I definitely think this is something that we need to address. My question would be fairly simple. Have you considered in this, instead of looking at this in terms of a specific person who could carry, look at just removing the gun-free label zone from K through 12 entirely, like a couple other states in our union have, California and Alabama namely, and they don't even require a training requirement. So an individual with a carry and conceal permit, so a teacher, for instance, could carry.
You can imagine how many phone calls, emails, and stop in a place of business to talk about this piece of legislation. I cannot tell you how many teachers in the state of Georgia who have called me, and without giving their name, of course, naturally they're not going to do that, they said, how about we teachers? I'm capable. Some have even said, I'm military. I've been in the military. I'm quite capable. I did not argue with or even try to challenge whether or not they were qualified to do that. But I simply said to them, I appreciate that. And even some said, you know, whether or not you pass this bill or not, I'm bringing my gun. It's going to be on me when I'm at school. So just, I don't think that would surprise anybody in this room that there's some that might be packing. But what I said is that we want to have as much control as possible. A little concern that I had with the classroom teachers is that they are in that classroom with any number of students. And I just use an example. Say it is the teacher's female and she might have her weapon in her pocketbook. and she may even think that it has been secured in a desk drawer. But yet there are those students who have seen that weapon in her pocketbook or in something that she might carry it in, might be tempted to try to get to it. An administrator typically is not with the students in a classroom environment. So not that I'm opposed to what you're suggesting, but as far as this piece of legislation, I felt like that we needed to nail it down a little more specifically to a group of individuals that could spend more time in being concerned with security. They're not worrying about putting something on the board, grading papers. They can be, and the other, this is what I've shared with teachers. If there was a school invasion, I believe the first responsibility of that teacher is not to go out and encounter that individual or individuals. Their first responsibility is the safety of those children, and that they go immediately and they have a plan how that they can get them to a safe place. I don't want them to be worrying about having to defend them with a weapon.
One further, if I could, Mr. Chairman. To that end, wouldn't we then enable those teachers to be able to protect those students by, if an active shooter walked through the door, then the teacher can't exactly keep those students safe outside of literally trying to protect them with their own body, which, you know, I feel like we're taking the ability for themselves to protect their students and themselves against someone who has criminal intent already and doesn't care what we're doing in here today.
Right.
And to a resource officer or administrator even, I have a concern that they can't be in every classroom all the time. And I also understand not everybody would choose, if that were the case, to carry anyway. But I guess the concern I really have, and again, was the reason for my question, why wouldn't we just allow individuals to carry concealed permits to carry?
Yeah. I don't mean to answer it in a way that sounds kind of disrespectful. That could happen, but not my bill. This bill is I've wanted this to be as clean and as precise as it could be, and to start making major changes on who carries a weapon. You know, that's sometime in the future that could be done. But I'm just kind of hard line. This is the bill that I felt at talking to administrators, to superintendents, to school board members. They felt like that this was the best bill that we could present and be reasonable, and with a reasonable expectation that it would pass. More layers we put on it, more possibilities we have that it might not pass. And I appreciate your question, and I understand where you're coming from, but I would rather it stay as is, and then you can deal with that at a later time.
Thank you. Let's see, Representative Hightower.
Yes, sir. Representative, I greatly appreciate you bringing this bill before us today, and I've done a lot of research on this topic. I want to point out to a lot of folks there's a code section that very few people know about. It's actually code section 16-11-127.1, subsection C, subsection 6.
Mm-hmm.
I'll read it real briefly, everyone. It says, a person who has been authorized in writing by a duly authorized official of the school to have in such person's possession or use as part of any activity being conducted in a school building, school property, or school function, a weapon which would otherwise be prohibited by this code section. Such authorization shall specify the weapon or weapons which have been authorized and the time period during which the authorization is valid. So that code section there already gives us the authority for whoever this person is, this duly authorized official of the school, to allow administrators, teachers, whoever they want, to carry a weapon on campus. However, what people don't realize is that your bill is actually making this much more specific. When it says a duly authorized official of the school, it doesn't give any guidance as to who that person is. Your bill, by what you're doing, is you're giving the direct power to the local school boards. You're saying, here it is. And we don't have to question who the duly authorized official of the school is. We don't have to question, is it just administrators or is it just teachers or who can apply for it, what the weapons is. Under the current law that it has now, they don't have to have the training. We don't really know who has the authority to do it. It could be a principal if they're duly authorized. We don't even know who can give the due authorization. So there's a lot of unclear there's a lot of issues in the current law that are unclear, and it seems as though if everyone does their research a little bit, your bill clears up all that stuff. The current bill, for people who are worried about people having guns on school campuses or wherever they are, anyone can have them now. Your bill, though, gives that direct power, it seems like, to the school board to choose whether or not they want to do this or not, and it also requires the training. Now, personally, I'm more towards Representative Cook's side. I'd rather just do away with the gun-free zones. But like you said, it's not going to happen in your bill, so I'd like to see something. But I don't think people realize that your bill is actually clarifying some existing law, and it actually puts some better parameters on existing law. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you, Representative. I knew about this existing law early on, and one of the things that did, and you've mentioned this, that it had no provision in there for training. That was just, allowing everyone and anyone who was designated by as a principal or a superintendent, whoever was in charge, could allow those teachers, administrators, whoever, to carry a weapon. And this legislation is just really tightening up and with a little more specification to the bill that we have there in 1611.
I have one other thing. My wife is a school teacher
Mm-hmm.
in the public school system. So is my mother. And a lot of times, we have these unfunded mandates that sometimes we may do accidentally, where we don't realize that we're forcing, a lot more expenses on school systems or any other type of organization. And I know I've heard some people ask about a fiscal note for this. I don't always, I'm not for putting more burden on the school system. I'm really not. And this here says in subsection D that the school board shall pay for all the cost. The thing that's getting me through there a little bit is that it's a may. In other words, we're not mandating this. They don't have to pay that cost because they don't have to implement this program. But there is going to be a feeling out there, and because I know that I would have it, that if one school system does allow it and one school system doesn't, for me personally, if my child's attending a school system that doesn't, I'm going to be getting on that school system. I'm going to be there going, hold on now, I can send my kid over here, and I got some armed administrators that can protect my child. Our president has armed people around him all the time. Let's have a few around my children. What do you feel about that? Because if they do start getting that pressure, even though we're not saying shall here and we're saying may, which is a huge difference whenever you're making law, what do you say to that when these school boards will go, well, yeah, it's may, but it's really not may because we're going to get a lot of pressure to do this? Do you have any explanation or anything to the funding requirement?
My wife was a 30-year educator. I've sat in many school board meetings. There's always pressure on those folks. Anyone in here that served on a school board knows exactly what I'm talking about. As to the cost, and I do not have specifically the numbers of what it costs to do the training, but I do know this, is that it would be very, very expensive if you were to go out and secure another body, put them on the payroll, provide them with the training, provide all the benefits that they would have to have. We're talking about $60,000, $80,000 a year per school, and I can imagine that that it's far, far less in just getting them certified than it would be to have to hire another person. I would like to see that, but a lot of systems, I won't say most, but a lot of systems just do not have the funds to add more employees to their payroll.
Let's see. 25. Who is that? Number 25. Who is that?
As best as I was spoken.
29.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my friend in the well, I applaud you for all your effort that you put into this bill and your work that you put into it. Also, I'd like to commend you for placing the training part in line 30, that they shall attend and successfully complete the basic training course for peace officers. I applaud you for that part. Now, on line 34, when they go back yearly, are they going to be required to maintain a certain number of hours annually, such as peace officers do to maintain their post-certification, or is there a number of hours, or will they just go through the firearms part? Because there's a lot more than just shooting the target that goes into safety. When you talk about firearm safety, there's a lot more that goes into the annual training than just going out on the firing range.
That is a great question. Certification, they must maintain their certification or they no longer can serve in this capacity. And that's obvious. This is going to be something that is going to come down from the peace officer standard. Those standards will have to be maintained or they will no longer be qualified to serve as a resource officer in any school or anywhere. And the second thing is that I am asking that from the annual qualifying to be moved to twice a year, semi-annually.
Thank you.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Representative Battles, I agree with your framework in terms of setting this up as an issue of protecting our students as opposed to one that is based on gun control, gun safety, gun rights, whatever you want to phrase it. My first question is a somewhat simple one, but I think very important, which is if we were to pass this and if a school board were to pass this, would this ensure that when my wife goes to pick up my first grader every day, that he'll be safe?
No, there's no guarantee if there was 100 officers in a school. Even if it was certified, police officers or sheriff's department, anyone, no guarantee there, because that's impossible to cover everything that you just included in the question. Is my wife safe? Is my child safe? That's a scenario that you could run circles around. There's no guarantee that they would always be safe, but the possibility is greater that they are safe by having someone there and available.
I agree with you in terms of the deterrence aspect. What I'd like to know is, are there any solutions that actually can further mitigate the risk that I think all of us agree, even if we pass this, will still exist? In other words, this is not a foolproof solution to protecting our kids.
No.
Are there any foolproof solutions to protecting our kids while they're at school?
Without an encampment of military around our schools, metal detectors and bars on the windows, lookouts on tops of buildings when they're out playing on the playground. I don't know any other way that you could say absolutely that that they're in a purely and totally safe environment.
And certainly none of us want that, and that's what caused me to wrestle with this a bit, because if it's not going to ensure that we won't have future tragedies, then what are we doing? Mm-hmm. And another thing which worries me, and some of the other committee members have raised it, is the costs and liability issue in terms of, to Representative Hightower's point, to take his thought just a step further, in terms of if one county were to pass it and then another county were not to pass it, understanding that then parents may pressure the county to do so, God forbid, and what we're paid to do is to think through these second and third order effects, in the county that did not approve this, would they be opening themselves up to pretty substantial liability for failing to do so and to take this measure? And at a time when already school budgets have been slashed, how does that work out, and what does that mean for our kids and for the education system in the state?
As far as the liability, you're an attorney, and I don't know how that would be litigated from a liability standpoint. There could be pressures on those school systems to conform as maybe their neighbors have done. I still go back to, and I know one of the issues, and it continues to be an issue, and an important issue, and that is the liability of what happens with that that officer if something terrible might occur. It would be, it's getting that liability insurance maybe as they have with their resource officers that they provide in maybe some of the schools or maybe in some of the activities. That is something that the school board is going to have to work out if they decide to do this. This is giving complete control to a school board to make the determination of what they do. It's kind of just taking the handcuffs off, so to speak, and let them make a decision. If they want to add the security, that's fine. If they do not, there's no penalty to them. The liability on the side of the school that does not conform, they might not be reelected. I don't know. That is a consequence that could occur from not complying with this piece of legislation. If there was actually an invasion in the school and there was a loss of life, I'm not sure what, if any, liability, because again, we go back to the May. If it's not the decision of that school board, they have opted out. They're not a part of this, and as though this never happened. And if they opt out of it from a liability standpoint of you did not have that resource person or you did not have the security there, I would question, and again, I certainly lean to those who are much more comfortable with the law than I am, as to whether or not they would have any liability consequences of not responding.
My biggest fear with this is if we were to pass this, and certainly I hope, all of us hope, that none of our children face any violence when they go to school. That goes without saying. Is if this went into law and then a school board authorized it, and then the person to whom we gave this authority were to kill some of our kids. That could happen under this, and that worries me. Again, you can't plan through every contingency and foolproof the world, but that would, God forbid that were to happen and we voted for this, I think we'd all have a lot of guilt working through it. So that's just a comment and not a question. And my final question, and I appreciate you taking the time to help me understand this, is what is the firearm that these individuals would be authorized to have? Would they be able to have an AR-15 or something comparable?
No.
Would it just be a sidearm?
No. And it is also in the legislation that it has to be a concealed weapon.
Can you refer me to line? Because I read that if you're referring to 24, it said including carrying such firearms concealed, but that wouldn't be mandatory by my reading.
Well, that was the intent when this was drafted by our legislative council. It was intended that it would be a sidearm and that it would be concealed. Again, if that needs to be tightened up a little bit to make that a little more understandable, that there's not a gray, that would be fine. That'd be fine with me.
Okay. And if you'll indulge me for just one more, if it is a sidearm, I may be one of the few members that have some experience with this during my 3 deployments. I don't know how comfortable I'd be with my 9mm going against an M4 or an AR-15 or something like that. So do you have any concerns there that we're not, if this were to pass, giving administrators enough authority, or do you think that a sidearm is sufficient authority to provide protection?
Okay, let me go back to what I do know. I do know the Cartersville City School System is a city chartered school system. We only have 5 schools, and they have a contract with the Cartersville Police Department. Every school has a police officer in that school. They're going to opt out of this. I know that they've already said that they would not be participating, and that's great. They don't need to. There's not one officer that's in any of those schools that have anything other either than a 9mm or a 45 or maybe even a 40. I don't know if they're carrying those 40s, but they're the only weapons that those officers have is a sidearm that is standard for a police officer. So there's no long guns in this.
Okay.
You couldn't conceal it if you did.
At least not easily.
Be a lot of overcoats.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Let's see. Representative Frazier.
Thank you once again, Chairman Powell. I'm truly struggling with this bill, Representative Ballard, and I guess a little bit more on a personal note because I do work for the school system, and I'm sitting here trying to visualize what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
What if this happened? What if that happened? And it brings me back to the principals and administrators again. My husband is a principal at an alternative school, and he has approximately 6 to 8 gangs there. They constantly are always in battle. And I'm thinking if he had a sidearm on and he's there trying to break up a fight, and that one of those members got hold, one of those students got hold to that firearm, and he has no control over that, that could be devastating. So all of these scenarios are going through my mind right now. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate the legislation here, and I know that we're trying to keep the children safe, but I don't see the safety factor in it because there's so many what ifs. And so I'm trying to struggle through this to understand. I understand the main point, but it is just too many what ifs that could happen for me right now.
And I appreciate the question. And if you don't mind, I asked a question. Do you have in that alternative school any law enforcement that is present in those?
We have law enforcement, and we need to focus a little bit, I think, more on the metal detectors. We have metal detectors in the school. A lot of them don't work, though. So we need to think more about screening these children as they go through the system so we can alleviate some of these guns that even get in the building. Right. You know, if a shooter wants to get into a school, they're going to find a way to get into that school. You know, but we have to work with the deterrents that we have already in place, and I don't think we're doing a very good job of that because I know we have school systems that have the metal detectors and they are unfunctional most of the time. You know, and that's just one alternative. But yes, we have resource officers there, but if you have a fight that wants to break out with 3 or 4 gangs, it could be catastrophic.
Well, and I appreciate this, and that is a concern that I have. But I'd almost ask the question, that peace officer that is in that school, if there was a fight that breaks out, and there's 20 or 30 gang members that they're trying to break up, 1 or 2 resource officers or police officers are going to have very little effect unless they have mace or some other means they can break them up. I can almost see that any officer could be overwhelmed and have their weapon taken from them. You know, whether it be in a peace officer that we have with our Sheriff and our state patrol, there are situations where if you're overpowered, even they could possibly have their weapon removed from their holster. So I know where you're going with this particular resource person, but in my mind, in thinking through the same scenario, that could happen to a law enforcement personnel. Maybe or maybe not as easily, but it could still happen.
Yeah, and it could happen, but a resource officer is totally trained, an administrator is not. So they probably, with the training that this bill will allow, I don't think it's enough training, because for a resource officer, it's second nature to react, not for an administrator. But thank you.
And may I just say this is not perfect. This is absolutely, and I'm the first one. When I was giving you my wish list was that every school system in the state of Georgia had the funds to have a full coverage of security in every school. I think in the upper grades especially, and in the middle and the high schools, I think there should be metal detectors. Now that'd be very difficult in getting the kids through the metal detectors and getting them to class, but we know we live in a very violent world, and there are so many out there that their intent is to do harm. And it's not always that person off the street that comes into the school. Sometimes it's the student within the school, and I think you had that maybe in South Fulton County. I believe it was last week, where there was an encounter outside between the gymnasium and the classroom where one student shot another student. And I think that maybe the weapon, and I'm assuming, I think that the weapon was probably hidden somewhere outside, because it happened outside, and they had gone through metal detectors. So there is no absolute secured resolve to this, not in the world which we live. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
But I do appreciate your comment.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Atwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the gentleman in the well. And thank you for bringing this legislation. If you could just help me, and I'm sorry for having to step out. I had to, and hopefully we haven't covered this in the past, I had to go get a bill in Ways and Means through. But I've been trying to wrap my mind around this ever since the events in Newtown. As a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I applaud you for struggling with this bill, and I know you and I have had some discussions on it. I've had some discussions from some quarters as to it's simply a Second Amendment right. Oh. And it's more than that, as I see it. And I have a couple of questions for it. And maybe you can help me through this. It's just not a person, an individual teacher, let's say, protecting themselves, as a person has a right to do if it's justified. And I have had to use force in my past life, and I have had to make a decision of whether or not to take a life. And it's a very quick thing that takes place. And so what I see this as bigger than that, because we are essentially, through this legislation, there's a two-part analysis as I see it. And that's not only protecting the individual, but also our responsibility to the child. As an agent, when we empower that teacher, or we empower that administrator, as an agent of the school and of the school board and of the county. And so therefore we have a requirement, as I see it, to make sure that when we give that empowerment to them, inside the confines of that school, that governmental entity, if you will, if it's not a private school, we take on, when we take that child, we take on the liability of that child. If we don't provide medical care for that child, we could be held responsible and have to pay a sum certain for it legally. So I think it's imperative upon us to look at the legislation and be sure that if it does pass out here, that we've met all the requirements that we should meet, apart and above from, here's a gun, go protect yourself and the child. Because I have a right as a parent to tell you, administrator, what I want you to do if you're going to put a gun out around my child. And I happen to support Second Amendment rights. I do. So one question I had for you is I was looking at qualifying on line 35, that they shall annually qualify with each firearm. Now, having carried a weapon as a police officer and as a federal agent for 35 years, we qualified, I think it was every 3 months or 6 months, I can't remember, depending on the agency I was with. And qualifying was just shooting at a target. And if you got a certain score, you were okay. You got to continue in your job. But part of our qualification also was judgment pistol shooting, where we had to go through a shoot, don't shoot scenario. And it was a computer-based training that I think probably a lot of the police officers do today, I would hope. And probably much better stuff than we used back then. Because there is an extremely short period of time from the time that the person pulls a gun or you see a person with a gun, your brain sends a message to your hand and back up to your brain that you're going to take that life or not. And so I would encourage you to add that and look at that to your bill as part of the requirements for these folks, especially people that are not engaged in this on a year-to-year basis, or maybe they're coming new to it. There may be some individuals that have that experience, but I'm not sure. And also, under that requisite two-part analysis, that agent of the school system, which we're effectively saying you are. Here's your pistol. You're an agent. You represent us. You have the job of protecting that child. To spell out what a firearm is, what kind of firearm that they should be using, because some firearms, as you know, can blow through this building. Others, I much prefer a .45. I like those. You know, I like the larger caliber, slower move bullets. So that's just a couple of comments I wanted to make to you and get your thoughts on it. And I'd be happy to work with you offline too on that if you need me to. And I applaud you for this.
And I do appreciate that question. We have discussed this, and especially as it has to do with what type of firearm. And the question has come up a couple of times. And it should be designated that it is the equivalent to or like those peace officers carry, a .45 or 9mm, or I don't know if any law and officers carry .40s. Now some of them do, but it would be standard with the local the local peace officers, whether it be in the jurisdiction of a city police department or whether or not it would be in a sheriff's department. That is where they would be receiving their renewal of their firearm training. And I know personally in our county, when they go to the firing range, it's quite the move, fire. It's more than just shooting at a stationary target and you being stationary, that it's far more involved. Not sure about the other systems, other law enforcement agencies, and how they do that. But that is a good point, and I appreciate that. And in specifying, I know the chairman and I have talked about specifying the type of weapon that they would be allowed to carry.
If I could say one other thing too, Mr. Chairman, I've had the pleasure of working with Representative Battles and sharing an office next to him, and these type of issues are very emotional and troubling to people on a lot of issues, a lot of levels. But he is one of the more thoughtful men that I've had representatives, I should say, that I've had the occasion to work with. That your degree of caring and discernment and thought, sir, it's a pleasure. You don't just pull something from the hip. You actually think about it, and I applaud you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Representative. 25, 26, 25. Representative Hightower.
Representative Battles, is your main goal to allow for these administrators to have a firearm? I mean, is that your ultimate goal here?
My ultimate goal, as I go back to the first, is to have a layer of safety, someone that might be able to intervene between someone who desires to do harm within a school setting, whether it be teachers or whether it be students. Just having that layer of protection is the intent. I wish, as I said, I wish we could do something better, but this would be at least one layer of opportunity if that administrator encounters someone coming in and they can, I don't know if you've ever seen anything, and I don't even want to get into this, what a 45 will do even to a jacket. Now, it may not penetrate it, but it will knock the stuffings out of them. They'll think twice. I mean, after they get up off the ground, normally, it's got a punch. So if they can do nothing but stun them for a moment and overpower them. But my intention is that they use this solely as a deterrent and safety as being that first layer of protection if someone tries to come into school.
The reason I was asking is because you said you were familiar with the code section that I referenced earlier. For me, sometimes it's, what a dangerous web we weave oftentimes. And a lot of these times, I'm never in favor of added restrictions on carrying firearms. It seems as though, and I don't know if you explored this option, the only problem that I have with the current code section that exists is that it's unclear on who can designate the person to carry the firearm.
Right.
It seems as though under the current code section, if we simply changed just about 4 words and said that a person who has been authorized in writing by the local school board and then left the rest of the language as is, we'd be given that local control, and all we'd be doing at that point in time is clarifying what is already there. We wouldn't be forcing possibly the funding. We wouldn't be adding these other restrictions. Because it's there now. Did you explore that? Because if we just said local school board there, we would have designated it and kind of, it would have.
I appreciate that. And again, yes, I looked at this legislation a number of times, and the two things that concerned me most was it did not designate who would be designating that person or persons. The second thing, it did not, and it should, in my opinion, have a component that requires them to have training. I felt like, and let me just give you a quick example of this. I was in a gun store in our town, and there was an elderly couple came in, and they bought a shotgun, and they bought a pistol. And the owner of that establishment said, do you know anything about shotguns, and do you know anything about pistols? They said, absolutely not. I did as I was supposed to. I went to the probate office. I got the background check. I'm clean as a whistle. So my wife and I are coming in to buy something and protect ourselves. And they said, we've never fired a gun. We know nothing about a gun, but that we want one. Now, that's an extreme situation. I'm always afraid somebody like that will shoot themselves instead of somebody else. But I felt like the legislation that is presently law, I felt like that there was a component that I was not comfortable with, and I felt like that we needed to have that training. But I do appreciate your thoughts.
Representative Glanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience, and Representative Ballard, thank you for your patience as well. This is a very sensitive subject. One of the things I wanted to make note of is that as a law enforcement officer, as a military person, not only are we trained to use our weaponry at the right time, just as important is the restraint of not using it. And like our colleague said a few minutes ago, it's sometimes a split-second decision. And so I certainly want to make that known that what are we going to do to make sure that the training is equal in restraint as it is employing. And the second part of my concern is a gentleman earlier from another organization stated that we should not be excluding any particular group of people from carrying guns under the Second Amendment. Well, by identifying these administrators, as a parent, they're there to keep my child safe. Well, what if as a parent, I believe that I can best keep my child safe, and parents start requesting to carry guns on schools? Where would we go?
It is not. It is not in this bill, and I'm not. I'm not going to deal with that issue. I'm a Second Amendment person. Don't mind saying that. I'm proud of it, and I believe that anyone that is lawfully, and I feel like that you need to be at least know the nomenclature of your weapon before you go out and start trying to use it. But there are certain restrictions, and those restrictions are that you cannot bring a weapon onto school property. And now people do it. I've already mentioned the fact that there around the state there are some teachers and maybe some administrators already have their weapon. All we got to do is kind of tighten it up a little bit and make them legal. But to say, okay, I have the right as a parent to come on to the school property would not be something that I would support. No, I couldn't do it. The other training issue is important, and those in law enforcement know this very well, is that this is not just going shooting at a target. There's a lot of simulation of, you were talking about the good guy, bad guy. They will have to go through those same simulators as does peace officers, and not that makes them prepared to encounter a human being, but surprisingly enough, if you were to go around and poll all the law enforcement officers in the state of Georgia, you'd find there'd be a small percentage of them who have ever had to shoot at or take a life. So it is, matter of fact, I have a great friend, was in the state patrol, was there 30 years, never had to fire his weapon at anyone. Now, and some maybe have had to do it numerous times. But I'm just saying on a percentage basis, they have not had to encounter that. So they don't really know whether or not they could do it. Now, I don't doubt that those that are in this room right here can do it. Just wanted to add that. I didn't want to make you mad. But I think that until you meet that challenge, you really don't know what you're going to do. But one of the incentives, I will say this, one of the incentives is that you stand between that person and children. That's motivation enough for me to put around somewhere on their body. And I'm going to do my very best to stop them. So training, yes, they're going to do that through simulators as well as target. But until that encounter, you never know what you're going to do.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience, and Representative Battle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Glanton. All right. Any other committee members have any questions of the author at this time before we start the second phase of these hearings? Would you mind staying with us?
I'm right here, Mr. Chairman, as long as you need for me to be.
All right, we've got a number of people from various and sundry groups have signed up, and I'm sure there's some folks who probably have not signed up. At this time, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. Some of y'all are starting to squirm on those hard benches out there, because I know these cushion chairs are sort of getting a little itchy. We're going to take a 5-minute recess and be back in here promptly.
Public schools for almost 30 years, 25 of those being in Georgia schools. I've been a teacher and I've been a school psychologist for the last 20 years. The issue of gun violence is something that, particularly in our schools, is something that is a very personal concern of mine. My niece, Austin Cloyd, was one of the students that was killed at Virginia Tech on April 16, 2007. So I know firsthand the horror of a tragedy like this, and I know firsthand the grief and the loss that a family goes through when guns get into the hands of the wrong people. I've lived it, and I've watched my family live it. The unspeakable tragedy that happened in Newtown this past December was also very personal to me. As one in my own profession, another school psychologist, Mary Shermack, was gunned down in her line of duty, much like I do all day long. And the reasons for these tragedies are complex, as are the solutions to the problem of gun violence in our schools. But I strongly believe that the answer does not include adding more guns to the equation. I believe we need to change the gun culture in our country, the mindset that says if we just had more guns, we'd be safer. If that were true, we would already be one of the safest countries in the world. I am here today representing 1 Million Moms for Gun Control. It's a grassroots, a new grassroots organization that has formed since the days of the Newtown shooting. I agree with the positions that they have on gun control and on sensible, common sense gun legislation. And our chapter leader is going to be discussing that later. I do feel our schools need to be armed, but not with guns. I like what Mary Catherine Raker, president of St. Paul Federation of Teachers, has said. She says, you want to arm schools? Good. Arm them with the time to teach. Arm them with smaller class sizes so they can get to know their students. Arm them with more mental health professionals like school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, so that we can address the needs, the mental health needs of students. But please don't expect them to be armed with guns. That will just increase the responsibility of already overburdened school personnel and create potential liability issues. With all respect to the law enforcement officers in the room, I don't think schools would expect to take a police officer, give them minimal training as a school psychologist or a school administrator, and then expect them to perform the role of a psychologist or an administrator in the heat of a crisis. There's not a day that goes by that I don't remember my niece, Austin, a very intelligent, talented young lady who left us far too soon. Her life gives me the courage to come here, and her death gives me the passion to speak out against guns in our school, particularly against arming school administrators. Mr. Battles, I share your wish that we would have less school shootings and that those would go away. But I have a wish, and that wish is that House Bill 35 will not pass out of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Does anyone here, the committee members, have a question? Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate you taking time to come today. Ayala Cole.
Thank you, everyone, for allowing us to speak on HB 35. I am the Atlanta chapter head of 1 Million Moms for Gun Control. 1 Million Moms for Gun Control, our national organization, began after the Sandy Hook tragedy. We have grown to over 58,000 members in 75 chapters in just 6 and 7 weeks. We are moms, we are grandmothers, we are aunts, and we are citizens. We are not activists by nature. We do not have a political party. We are heartbroken when we see our children killed in senseless violence. We are here now because we know that you care about our children too. We appreciate the spirit, but we also implore you not to put our school administrators, teachers, and personnel in the front lines. They are there to educate our children. What makes a great teacher and administrator is not the same as what makes a great police officer. It's not just about training. It's about who's ideal for doing that kind of job. They should not be signed to protect our children from dangerously armed gunmen. We have all read reports and statistics and professional opinions, but there is one thing that stands out that is statistically irrefutable, and that just makes common sense. Where there are more guns, there are more violent deaths. We in the United States had more than 30,000 gun deaths in the past year. Our kids are being murdered with guns. Our kids are committing suicide with guns. Our kids are picking up guns and shooting each other. We are glad that the Armed Resource Officer was there to apprehend the 14-year-old, the shooter of the 14-year-old at Price Middle School. But that didn't keep him from getting shot. We need to do better at making sure that our kids don't have access to guns. We need to do better at doing background checks. We need to do better as a state in reporting criminals and the mentally unstable to the federal system database. As a state, we get poor grades for reporting to that database. We should fix that. And yes, we want you to ban military-style weapons and ammunition magazines greater than 10. We want you to decrease the scope of concealed weapons laws, not increase it. We want to work with you to increase the safety of our children. We urge you to vote no on this legislation and work with us to reduce guns in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any questions from any of the committee members? Thank you, ma'am, for your time. John Superintendent's Association.
You did fairly well with that pronunciation. That's pretty good, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. John Zahner with the Georgia School Superintendent Association. I am a former school superintendent, retired. I am also a former federal law enforcement officer. I appreciate your comments, sir, Representative Atwood. And dealing with the training issue, I think that is critical. When you're putting the, and I'll put on my hat as a superintendent first, and I will extend my appreciation with your intent, Representative Battles, in trying to protect our children. That is a primary role that we have as educators, whether you're a superintendent, whether you are a principal, whether you are a teacher. One of our primary roles is safety. And that safety, although when I entered the profession, I never thought that it would come to having to put a sidearm on. It was safety on the playground. It was safety from other children, picking on other children, bullying, those kinds of things. Obviously, we've raised the stakes here. And I think I appreciate the thoughtful discussion the committee has had to this point in addressing the training issue, because I really think that may be the key to whether or not this is something that will move forward. I don't know what branch you're in the federal law enforcement. We had to qualify every month, and not only qualify with a weapon shooting at a target, we also had to do the scenarios. Also, there was some psychological retesting going on because things happen to people in our human condition, and they don't react the same way every month or every year. And those things also need to be discussed and considered as issues. And I'm taking off my lobbyist hat as the Georgia School Superintendent Association, talking a little bit more like a federal law enforcement officer, and that is that we're kind of dealing with the bottom rung of the ladder here. You know, in law enforcement, we try to prevent access. I was in the Secret Service. Our job was to prevent access to the target. That was job one. And job two was to constantly monitor. You monitor and scan the environment constantly. And job three was to respond. Here we're responding to a tragedy, numerous tragedies around our country and our schools. And in this case, in what little bit I know, and I certainly don't know all the details of Sandy Hook, they had a pretty good access control situation, but this particular person got through it. And you know, all those things have to be considered. Our schools were not built to prevent access. They were built to accept and have free-flowing students throughout the building, free-flowing teachers, administrators walking through, going from class to class, going to the cafeteria, going to the playground. So somebody talked about culture. Yeah, we're dealing with a very cultural shift here, and we're responding to it. And I do appreciate the thoughtful discussion that this committee is having and the questions that you've raised, because I think they're very, very valid questions. And the only thing I would say is be very judicious and move slow to move fast. And I'll be glad to address any questions. Thank you, sir.
Do you have any questions of the committee? Mr. Zahner? No? Well, thank you for your comments. If you would, before you leave today, did you say you're also representing the school board, the School Superintendents Association? Would you mind leaving your contact name and numbers with the committee secretary? And thank you again. Angela Palm, School Board Association.
We appreciate Representative Battles as he looked at this issue, and I do believe if he had a pot of money, he would have given it to all the schools to hire school resource officers. But we don't have that, and so he looked for another alternative. I can tell you the association has not taken a position because and just getting informal feedback from our members, we have some who think this is a wonderful idea, and some who think it's a terrible idea. Some of them would like this option to be available to them, and some of them would not. Some of them partly for the reasons talked about earlier with the pressure that if they were allowed to do it, then they would be pressured to do so, and they would be uncomfortable because they hire educators to teach children, and they aren't accustomed to thinking in terms of law enforcement. And so they're concerned about that. There's some concern about the training. Part of that has been talked about here today, and how much training, what kind of training, liability issues. But I believe that all of those issues would have to be discussed on a local basis with their attorney, with their insurance company. There are a number of factors that the local board would have to consider, and we appreciate the fact that this is being left as a local decision. It's not a requirement that they do so, and so that they can talk about it in their own community and do that. One of you mentioned that you would move your child to a school where this was being done. I've also had parents tell me they would move their child to a school where it wasn't being done. So people, just like the educators, are all over the place on this, and thank goodness for a diverse society and different ideas. Representative Taylor, I did want to tell you the question came up about how they vote on these people. It is correct that it would be done in executive session to discuss a personnel issue, but they would have to vote publicly. So unless there is some exception in the law that I'm unfamiliar with that would perhaps as a part of a safety process that would allow them to keep non-public the names of the people who have been authorized to do this. The names would have to be released if they were asked for. So I just wanted to let you know that. And I know that just based on your questions, you were all considering this judiciously, and I appreciate the attention and the thoughtfulness of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any questions? No questions? Thank you, ma'am. Let's see. Mr. John Monroe. How you spell what's your last name?
Monroe.
You know, we need to send some of these folks back to school so they can write where I can read their names.
Well, I did tell my mom I wanted to go to med school, but it never happened. So, John Monroe with GeorgiaCarry.org. Mostly I wanted to bring to the committee's attention, Mr. Chairman, existing law and how the proposed legislation would or would not interact with it. I know Representative Hightower has already pointed out 1611.127.1C6, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I also wanted to point out the existing law in 1611.127.1C7. Under that provision in current law, anyone with a weapons carry license, and there are some 600,000 of those in Georgia, can go into any school in this state carrying a firearm, go anywhere in the school, go to a classroom, pick up a student, and leave without the consent or knowledge of the school if the person happens to be carrying concealed, and that's perfectly legal. The only requirements are the person has to have the license and the person has to be going into the school to pick up or drop off a student. That happens all over the place every day without incident. None of those people have a training requirement. Also under existing law, anyone with a license can take a firearm to a school and leave it in their car in the parking lot. And that's been the law now for 3 years, and before that it was the law for teachers for many years. And that happens all over the state every day without incident. I've heard some discussion of the need for training, and I'd just like to point out the irony that earlier this afternoon this committee voted unanimously to allow retired judges to carry guns in schools without a training requirement. And these judges haven't undergone a background check that would include judges who've never fired a gun, never seen a gun, never touched one, perhaps until they retire and decide that's what they're going to do is start carrying guns to school. But there's no training requirement on them. I know, I think it was Representative Hightower again who mentioned that perhaps we could just change 1611.127.1C7, I'm sorry, C6 to address local school boards being the duly authorized school officials. And I think your point's well taken, but that wouldn't address private schools. And currently the code that prohibits carrying guns in schools applies to public as well as private schools. So if we change the current law, which says duly authorized school official to account for different kinds of school officials in different schools, if we change that to school boards, I think that would apply just to public schools or private schools. If they happen to have a school board, they don't necessarily have something called a board. I don't disagree that duly authorized school official is not the model of clarity. I think it would be difficult to conclude other than that a superintendent and probably a principal of any given school is a duly authorized school official, since they operate as more or less a CEO of a school. But in any event, the current law does allow duly authorized school officials, whoever they are, to authorize anyone to carry a firearm in school. I don't know that we have any statistics on how often that's happened already throughout the state, but presumably it has in many districts, and again, there haven't been incidents as a result of that. And I'm not sure what would happen if we were to implement the proposed bill with this existing language, and how the two would marry each other. If, for example, a school district intended to implement the proposed bill and started down that path, authorized an official or an administrator to carry, went through the training and everything, and then somewhere then later down the line decided to defund future training, or the person just skipped the future training or something like that, then at some point the person would no longer be in compliance with the new provision, but would continue to be in compliance with the existing provision that only requires the authorization from a school official. So that would be kind of an awkward situation where somebody started down one path and then quit adhering to that requirement but continued to adhere to another requirement, so that you wouldn't really have a violation at all. And then one final point, I think you could have the situation where, say, a principal wanted to implement this provision, went to his school board, the school board had discussion, decided they didn't want to do it, told the principal, no, we're not going to authorize you under this new provision. I don't think there's anything under the existing code section that Representative Hightower referred to that would stop the principal from authorizing himself or herself to go ahead and carry anyway. So I think if something like this is going to be implemented, there ought to be some kind of marriage between the existing provisions, and we certainly wouldn't support a mandatory training requirement when none exists under current law, even for all the other people who are exempt from the firearms laws, including the judges that were just authorized or will be authorized if the vote on the earlier bill today passes. And there are many other people on that list already, such as clerks of superior courts and people like that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
All right. Questions? Sir, Mr. Holcomb.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. I have some questions, or at least a question. I'm not sure that we're comparing apples to apples with your analogy in terms of, for example, the judges. At least federal judges certainly go through a lot of background checks and vetting before they're approved by the Senate to take the bench. My understanding is I think the state and local judges also do, but the intent there isn't that they would be put into the position of protecting our kids at schools. So with that in mind, I think that the intent of the training requirement is to ensure or to help, if this were to pass, administrators exercise their ability to protect the students. And it seems like a rational and reasonable measure to ensure that there's at least a minimum level of proficiency for them to do this task. Is that a point that you disagree with?
Well, I don't disagree that if a school district, I'll just call it the district, not knowing like whether it's going to be the administrator or the school board or whoever, but if a school district or a school decided that it wanted to have armed personnel that weren't regular full-time law enforcement officers, if they wanted to have those people be armed either under current law, which they can do, or under the proposed bill, which they would be able to do, if they wanted to have those people be armed, I think it probably would be in their discretion to do so. My point was that, as an example, the retired local judges under the bill that was voted due pass earlier today, this committee recommended authorizing other people to be able to carry firearms in schools and elsewhere throughout the state without any training at all. And I was just pointing out the discrepancy there.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holcomb. Any other questions from any of the committee members? We want to let you off light.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Not quite so soon. I got a
All
question to ask you. You know, I've been pondering this proposition ever since it was dropped in, and I've also been pondering other legislation. Not just what's been dropped in, but as you have heard, I don't know if it's, well, maybe one or two folks may freely avow that they're not Second Amendments, but basically everybody believes in the Second Amendments and their rights. But I think that's where it comes to an end, because then you've got a pretty wide gap into this. You made a reference just a minute ago about our previous action on a bill about retired judges. Well, to me, I seem to look at that as a difference, that you've got judges and retired judges who are sitting in a position of authority that may have gained enemies at some point. And these folks were given that authority not to go out and to protect someone, but to protect themselves. In this issue, we're talking about allowing school systems to basically let someone have a weapon on school property, not so much to protect themselves, but to protect somebody else's folks, their kids. And to me, that's where the difference is in this. And I bring that up because I've had a real hard time trying to figure out what in the world is everybody so scared about some level of proficiency training. In this state, if you take a background check, give your fingerprint, you pass a background check, pay the probate judge $75 in most cases, you have a license to carry a concealed weapon, whether you know how to use that weapon or not. But nobody, it appears that none of the Second Amendment activist groups is like they're deathly afraid of that. It looks to me like y'all would be more in favor of a proficiency standard so that folks know what they're doing with that weapon. Can you explain to me why did none of the groups, I mean, we're evolving here.
I
help
can't
me evolve with this idea.
I can't speak for other groups, but I can speak for GeorgiaCarry.org. We are very much in favor of training. In fact, we're in the process of developing our own training program to offer to the public because we think training for firearms proficiency is good for our members, for people who have licenses to carry weapons, and also for the general public. Even if you don't even own a firearm, it's a good idea to know what they are and generally how they work. The same as when I was growing up, my dad said, you need to know how to drive a standard transmission even if we don't have one, because you never know when that's what might be the only thing available. So we're very much in favor of training. What we're not in favor of is mandatory government-imposed training. We don't believe that there ought to be a training requirement to exercise an individual fundamental constitutional right, much like there's no requirement to undergo training to attend church or to write a letter to the editor of the newspaper. So we're very much in favor of training. We just don't believe that the government ought to require it.
Now, would that also include what is commonly known as post-certification training requirements for law enforcement? Would that carry on to those folks also?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking if we're not in favor of mandatory training for law enforcement?
In the state of Georgia, if you're going to be a law enforcement officer, you have to be post-certified. Part of that process is to take training in firearms, safety, proficiency, knowing when to use the laws about use of deadly force. Do you think that should be necessary for law enforcement officers? Those people who have a responsibility to protect those of us and the rest of the world.
Well, I think that anyone who has a job, the state can, if it chooses, impose training requirements. Certainly not opposed to training requirements for law enforcement officers. I'm an attorney. I have training requirements. I have to do new training every year. I'm not opposed to that. What we are opposed to is citizens being required by the government to undergo training in order to exercise a fundamental constitutional right.
So let me be sure I'm real clear on this.
All right.
For those of us out here, us civilians out here that are exercising our Second Amendment rights, you don't think it needs to be a mandate that you have training before you have that license to carry?
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't.
But if you are in a position that you're going to be enforcing the law, that if it is the will of the government to be sure that those people are properly trained and proficient with that weapon, so that if they're ever called to pull that weapon or use that weapon, that they're shooting the perpetrator instead of shooting herself in the foot, getting it out of the holster. So you'd say that that is permissible in those cases.
I don't see a problem with imposing training requirements as a prerequisite to having a particular job, no.
Thank you, and you have someone else now.
Thank you.
Mr. Hightower.
Mr. Chairman, this was pointed out to me earlier. I think one of the large differences is that these law enforcement officers have arrest powers that go to their training. The average citizen doesn't have an arrest power, so to speak. So for me, that draws a little bit of a line, but that's just me personally.
No, that's good. He just answered what I thought, and thanks for helping me to understand that. Anyone else have a question? Thanks, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you be kind enough to leave your contact number?
I would be delighted to.
Be very grateful. Do we have any other questions? I think that's the last. Do we have anyone else who is not signed up to speak? Anyone in the law enforcement area? Anybody from post council? We got people who are shying away from this issue, I can see. All right, I want to make a suggestion at this point, and I'm going to allow the committee to follow up if they want to make some suggestions to this. You know, this committee, I've always prided myself that any committee I chaired was very open for dialogue and debate, and I think we've seen that today. We have an issue that we certainly got folks on both sides of the issue, but even more so, I think that even the folks that are in favor of the issue, they see that there's a lot of things that need to be perfected in this particular issue. You know, I'm just jotted down a few things, language about whether that weapon would be concealed or open or whatever's to the convenience. Whether this is voluntary, there's no language in here that makes this voluntary toward those school employees, something that I think needs to be addressed. The safety and proficiency training, what level are we talking about? We're not talking about average. I think we're moving anyone who chooses to do this from being an average citizen to being a protector, not of themselves, but of other folks. So whether that safety and proficiency needs to be a part of that. Liability issues. You know, I think that was certainly, has probably came through that there'll be certain liability issues. Now, we've been in here for quite a while today, and I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair that we're going to have a committee, subcommittee, that is going to work on these issues. And they're going to have this bill perfected to a certain degree. And I'm going to ask you folks, and if any of you feel uncomfortable about being on this this subcommittee, I want you to tell me up front. Representative Glanton, I think he had expressed to me that he would serve on there. Representative Hightower? All right. Representative Jackson, would you be agreeable? Representative Hitchens? All right. And with that, the three officers of the committee, by virtue of being an officer of this committee, you just got the yoke hung around your neck. What I would ask the other members of the committee, if you have specifics that came out of this dialogue and discussion today, I want y'all to feel free to speak up to those that's on this committee. This committee will meet again next week. We may have a need to change the time of the meeting, since next week we're going to be, and a lot of us are going to be inundated with DOT elections, so we might have to change this. But to all the committee members, talk to the folks that's on this subcommittee. Put your 2 cents out there, because I want something perfected, and there will be a vote on this bill next week. Any other questions?
May I just make a statement?
Yes.
I appreciate everyone who has had interest in this bill. One of the things that I do not want to do, and I appreciate the chairman's concern about this, is that if we're going to do it, let's do it right. And I believe, and it didn't. You didn't have to have my consent for this, by no means. But I think it's the best thing to do is for us to go through this and to perfect this as best we can, and then make a decision off that. So I do appreciate the time and the effort and the input.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I will tell you how much I appreciate the diligence that you put forth in this. You're a very kind gentleman. I will tell you that some of the stuff that goes in, you may not be in total agreement, but I would say keep your mind open on it.
Certainly will.
See if we can make something that works.
That's good.
Thank you. No questions? Anyone else have a comment? So if any of y'all have any other comments, feel free to email the members of this committee or pick up that phone and call us. And it's been a pleasure. This meeting is now over.
Thank you.